Hey, Tere, and welcome to Shadows of Thales. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This little corner where darkness softens, and stories breathe quietly in the background. Before we drift into tonight's tale, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if what you hear truly feels right for you. Your comfort matters more than anything else. If you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time the night found you. I love seeing how our growing community gathers from so many different places. It's a reminder that even in silence, we're connected. I hope you'll allow this video to accompany you for a while. Every story here is shaped to ease your thoughts, soothe your mind, and guide you gently into the late hours with a touch of mystery and calm. So go ahead, lower the lights, make yourself comfortable, take a slow breath, let the noise of the day melt away. And now, let's step into tonight's story together. No one tells you that houses can feel lonely. They talk about creaking floors, cold rooms, strange drafts, but not loneliness. And yet, that was the first thing Sammy felt when he moved in. The house was old, but not abandoned. It stood at the end of a quiet street, its paint faded, its windows dark, even during the day. The realtor had smiled too much when showing it. She sighed it was full of character. She did not say why it had been empty for so long. Sammy took it anyway. It was cheap, and he needed quiet. The first night passed without incident. The second night, too. On the third night, as Sammy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard it. A slow sound, soft, rhythmic at first. He thought it was the wind moving through the walls. The house was old, air could get trapped anywhere. But this sound was different. It wasn't a whistle. It wasn't a rattle. It sounded like breathing. Inhale, exhale, deep, patient. Sammy held his own breath without realizing it, listening closely. The sound came from behind the wall beside his bed. He laughed quietly to himself. Old houses make noise, he whispered. Saying it out loud made him feel calmer. The breathing continued. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into sleep. The next morning, Sammy noticed something strange. The house felt warmer than it should have. Not uncomfortable, alive with heat. He touched the wall where the sound had come from. It felt warm. Not from sunlight, not from pipes, just warm. He frowned, but shook it off. Old insulation, maybe. That night, the breathing returned. This time, it came from multiple places. Behind the walls, above the ceiling, beneath the floor. The house was breathing around him. Slow, steady, as if it were asleep. Sammy tried turning on the television to drown it out. The sound lowered, almost politely, but did not stop. When he turned the TV off, the breathing grew louder again, as if the house noticed his attention. Over the following days, Sammy stopped inviting people over. He couldn't explain why. Something about the house felt private, almost jealous. The breathing never happened during the day. Only at night, only when he was still. One evening, curiosity overcame fear. Sammy pressed his ear against the wall. The sound was clearer now, closer, and then he felt it. A faint vibration, a gentle rise and fall. Like a chest. He pulled back quickly, heart racing. "Get a grip," he muttered, but the house did not like that. That night, the breathing was louder than ever. The walls creaked, not from age but from movement. Sammy lay frozen in bed, staring into the darkness. Then he heard something new, a pause. The breathing stopped. For a moment, the house was completely silent. And then, a whisper. So faint, he almost missed it. "You hear me now?" Sammy sat upright, his skin crawling. The voice had come from inside the wall. "No," he said out loud. "I'm imagining this." The house breathed again, slower now. He did not sleep. The next morning, Sammy packed a bag. He didn't care how irrational it seemed. He just knew he couldn't stay another night. As he zipped the bag shut, he noticed the house was quiet. Too quiet. No creaks, no distant settling. Almost attentive. Sammy walked to the front door and turned the handle. It didn't move. He tried again. Harder? Locked? That's impossible, he said. He never locked it. His breathing grew shallow as he backed away. The house exhaled a long, deep sound that vibrated through the floor. The walls felt warmer now. Hotter. Let me out, Sammy whispered. The house answered. This time, the voice was everywhere. In the walls, in the ceiling, in the floor beneath his feet. You live inside me now. Sammy ran to a window and tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. The breathing grew faster. Excited, the walls seemed to shift inward, hoosed slightly, enough for Sammy to notice, enough to panic. Please, he begged. I'll be quiet. I won't listen anymore. The house paused, then, gently. I don't want quiet. I want company. That night, the lights went out. The house breathed softly as Sammy sat curled on the floor, shaking. He didn't fight anymore. He didn't scream. Slowly, his breathing began to match the rhythm around him. Inhale, exhale. The walls cooled, satisfied. Weeks later, a passerby stopped in front of the house. They thought they heard something through the walls, a soft sound. Familiar. Breathing. And deep inside the house, something new breathed with it, perfectly in sync. The babysitting job seemed easy. Too easy. Even the house was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, where the streetlights hummed and nothing ever seemed to happen. The parents were polite, well-dressed, and exhausted in that way only new parents can be. As she handed over the keys, the mother said gently, "There's just one thing. Our son doesn't sleep very well." I smiled. "That's okay. Most kids don't." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. "He doesn't cry," she added. "He just stays awake." I didn't think much of it, but I would later. The child's room was neat. Too neat. No toys scattered on the floor. No drawings on the walls. Just a small bed, a nightlight, and a wooden rocking horse in the corner that looked older than the house itself. The boy sat on his bed, his legs dangling slightly above the floor. He looked about 5. His eyes followed me as I entered. "You can call me Lina! Primera Saeed, softly!" "I know," he replied. His voice was calm. Flat, not rude, just certain. I paused, then laughed lightly. "All right then." I checked the clock. 8:47 p.m. "Ready for bed?" I asked. The boy nodded. I turned off the main light, leaving only the warm glow of the nightlight. Shadows stretched gently across the room. I tucked him in and pulled the blanket up to his chest. "Good night," I whispered. He didn't respond. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. "He's still here." I turned back. "Who is?" He lifted one small finger and pointed not at the door. Not at the window, but at the far corner of the room, where the light barely reached. "The man," he said. I followed his gaze. There was nothing there. "That's just a shadow," I said calmly. "Shadows can look strange at night." The boy shook his head slowly. "He doesn't like the light," he said. "That's why he stays there." A chill moved through me, but I smiled anyway. "Get some sleep," I said. "I'll be right outside." I closed the door halfway and sat on the couch, telling myself not to be ridiculous. Children have active imaginations. It's normal. An hour passed. The house was silent. Too silent. I checked the baby monitor. The boy lay perfectly still. His eyes were wide open. Watching. Not the camera. Not the ceiling. The corner. I stood up and walked back to the room. I opened the door slowly. "Sweetie," I said, "why aren't you sleeping?" The boy didn't blink. "He's closer now," he whispered. I flipped on the light. The corner was empty, but the air there felt different. Heavy, as if it had been disturbed. I crouched beside the bed. "There's no one here," I said softly. The boy finally looked at me. "He doesn't like when you lie," he said. My throat went dry. I straightened up and stepped back. I'm going to get you some water, I said quickly. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. My reflection in the dark window looked pale and frightened. This is stupid, I whispered to myself. I went back to the room. The light was still on. The boy was no longer looking at the corner. He was looking behind me. I froze. Slowly, carefully, I turned around. Nothing. My heart was pounding. Why does he stand behind you? The boy asked. My voice barely worked. There's no one behind me. The boy frowned. He's smiling, he said. I stepped backward until I felt the solid door frame. I think it's time to sleep, I said, forcing calm into my voice. I turned off the light again, more to escape than to help him sleep. As I closed the door, I heard him speak once more. He says, you can hear him now. I didn't sit back down. I stood in the hallway, staring at the boy's door. The baby monitor crackled softly. Then, very faintly, beneath the static breathing. Not the child's. It was slow, deliberate, and it was too close to the microphone. My phone buzzed. A text from the mother. Is he asleep? I typed with shaking fingers. Not yet. He's a little restless. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then another message. Please, don't turn off the nightlight. My heart sank. I hadn't told her I'd turned it off. I opened the door again. The room was darker than before. The nightlight was off. Did you turn it off? I asked. The boy shook his head. He did, he said. The corner felt deeper now. Wider. As if the darkness had learned how to stretch. I reached for the light switch. Before I could touch it, the boy spoke. He says, if you turn on the light, he'll stay. My hand froze in the air. Stay, I whispered. The boy nodded. He only leaves when it's dark, he said, but he never goes far. The breathing grew louder, not through the monitor, in the room. Behind me, I slowly backed away, my skin prickling. I think I need to leave, I said. The boy looked confused. But he picked you, he said. He doesn't like being alone anymore. The lights flickered. The breathing stopped. For one terrible moment, the house felt empty. Then a voice. Low. Close to my ear. He never sleeps, it said. And now, neither will you. The lights came back on. The corner was empty. The boy lay down and closed his eyes. He looked peaceful, as if something had finally left him. I stumbled out of the house, keys shaking in my hand. I didn't look back. The parents returned an hour later. They found their son asleep for the first time in weeks. When the mother checked the corner of the room, she shivered. The air there was cold, empty, satisfied. Across town, I sat in my apartment, staring into the dark corner of my bedroom. I haven't slept since that night, and something is learning where I live. The first message arrived on a Tuesday night. Evan was half asleep, drifting between thoughts, when his phone vibrated softly on the bedside table. The screen lit the dark room with a pale glow. 3:17 a.m. and notification. No sound. Just the vibration. The message was short. Are you awake? Evan frowned, his eyes struggling to focus. He unlocked his phone, squinting against the sudden brightness. The sender's name made his stomach tighten into a cold, hard knot. It was his own number, his own contact photo. He stared at it for several long seconds, waiting for logic to catch up with the fear that was already sprinting ahead. This has to be a glitch, he muttered to himself. Just a weird, late-night glitch. He didn't reply. He just locked the phone and placed its screen down. The room went dark again, but the silence felt different now. Heavier the next night, it happened again. 3:17 a.m., the same soft, insistent vibration against the wood of his nightstand. The same message glowing on the screen. Are you awake? This time, Evan wasn't just confused. He was unnerved. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and began a frantic digital investigation. He checked his call log, his sent messages, his phone's settings. Nothing was out of the ordinary. No scheduled texts, no strange apps running in the background. It was as if the message had simply willed itself into existence. With a trembling thumb, he typed a reply. "Who is this?" The message showed as delivered. He waited, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. Nothing. No response came. Then, at 3:80, the phone went silent again, as if the strange window of communication had slammed shut. By the third night, Evan was waiting. There was no pretense of sleep. He lay in bed with his phone clutched in his hand, screen already on, his eyes locked on the digital clock. He watched the numbers change. 3:16. Then 3:17. The vibration came instantly, a familiar shock in his palm. "Are you awake?" His heart was beating faster now, but his hands were steady. He had a strange resolve. Yes. He watched, holding his breath. 3 little dots appeared, indicating someone or something was typing. They paused, then disappeared. A new message arrived. Good. Evan sat, bolt upright in bed. Good for what? He whispered into the empty room, but there was no reply. The silence that followed was deeper than before. The air felt thick, heavy. It was then that he noticed something small, but profoundly wrong. The familiar, rhythmic ticking of his wall clock had stopped. On the 4th night, Evan abandoned his bedroom. He wasn't going to be a passive victim lying in the dark. He sat in the living room with every single light on, the television murmuring quietly in the background, a futile attempt to fill the oppressive silence he knew was coming. 3:17 a.m., his phone vibrated in his hand. "Are you awake?" He was ready this time. "Why do you keep texting me?" he typed, his fingers moving quickly. The reply was immediate. "Because you answer now." A deep, bone-rattling chill moved through him, completely ignoring the warmth of the lights. "This isn't funny." "Stop." The 3 dots appeared again. Paused. "You weren't supposed to notice me yet." Evan shot to his feet, his pulse thundering in his ears. "Notice what?" His side allude, his voice cracking. His phone vibrated again, the screen illuminating his pale, frightened face. The message read, "The time between sleeping and waking." He glanced frantically at the clock on the cable box. 3:17. It hadn't moved. It was stuck. On the 5th night, Evan didn't even try to sleep. He brewed pot after pot of black coffee, pacing the floors of his apartment until his feet ached. He kept his eyes open until they burned, staring into space, fighting the heavy pull of exhaustion. But 3:17 arrived anyway. The vibration felt closer this time. Stronger, more personal. "Are you awake?" Evan's hands shook so badly he could barely type. "I haven't slept." The reply took longer than usual, stretching the tension to an unbearable point. "That's a problem." "Why?" A typed back, his throat tight. Several seconds passed. The lights in the apartment flickered once. 10th day, a new message appeared. "Because I need you, tired." He finally asked the question that had been screaming in his mind for days. "Who are you?" The answer came slowly, appearing one word at a time, as if being deliberately typed to maximize his terror. "I'm where you go before sleep." The phone grew unnaturally warm in his hand, almost hot. On the 6th night, Evan had a new plan, a desperate one. At 3:16, he held down the power button and shut his phone off completely. The screen went black. No vibration, no light. A wave of profound relief washed over him. He'd done it. He'd cut it off. Then the whisper came, from the darkness directly behind him. "Are you awake?" Evan spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. The room was empty. But then, on the coffee table, his phone turned itself on. The screen flared to life. 3:17 a.m. a new message appeared. But this time there was no vibration. It just was. "Asik, you don't need the phone anymore." Evan backed away, stumbling, until his back hit the cold wall. His reflection in the dark television screen looked wrong. It was delayed by a split second, and in the reflection, his hands were still moving. Still typing on a phone he was no longer holding. "Please stop!" Evan typed, the words appearing on the screen even as his real hands were pressed flat against the wall. The reply was instant. "Turn around." His breathing was shallow, ragged. "No, you already did." Evan felt it then, a presence not in the room, but behind his eyes, a pressure inside his own thoughts. The world around him blurred slightly, as if reality itself were losing focus, becoming soft and pliable. The phone he wasn't holding slipped from fingers he couldn't feel. It hit the floor, but the screen stayed lit, glowing with a single, repeating time stamp. 3:17 a.m. over and over. The next morning, Evan's apartment was quiet. The phone lay on the floor, screen dark and lifeless. On the bed, Evan slept deeply, peacefully. For the first time in days, and at exactly 3:17 a.m. that night, in another room, in another house, miles away, a different phone vibrated on a nightstand. A screen lit up a dark room, and a new message appeared. "Are you awake?" And somewhere in the liminal space between sleeping and waking, something smiled. No one wanted room 909. It was tucked away at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway, past the creaking elevators, past the peeling floral wallpaper, and the faint, lingering scent of disinfectant that never quite faded. Travelers, seasoned or new, would avoid it. They'd walk by, their footsteps quickening just a little, their eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending they hadn't noticed the tarnished brass number on the door. They pretended they didn't see it as they passed, as if acknowledging it would invite some unseen trouble. Some said it was just an old superstition, a ghost story whispered between staff members to spook new guests. Others claimed the air itself felt different near that door, heavier, colder, charged with a strange static. And some, well, they had never stayed long enough to find out for themselves. But Daniel didn't care about superstition. He was just tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He was tired of crowded hotels where you could hear your neighbor's every cough, tired of overpriced rooms that offered nothing but a lumpy mattress, and most of all tired of a transatlantic flight that had left his body aching and his mind restless. So when the receptionist offered him the last available room, 909, for a steep discount, he took it without a second thought. The room, at first glance, was disappointingly ordinary. A simple bed with neatly folded, soft-looking linens. A small wooden desk tucked into the corner, a generic landscape painting hanging above it, a standard bathroom with clean, white tiles. The curtains were thick, heavy velvet, successfully blocking out the relentless glow of the city lights below. It was exactly what he needed. Echetin offered a weary thanks to the receptionist and shut the heavy door behind him. The click of the lock echoed in the sudden silence. Alone at last, he tossed his suitcase onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed, sinking into the mattress. The clock on the bedside table glowed with red numbers. 11:15 p.m. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. He couldn't be sure. Time felt blurry, stretching and compressing in the silent, dark room. When he finally stirred, a jolt of awareness shot through him. He hadn't slept. Not even for a moment. And the room, it felt different. Now, the air, which had seemed stuffy before, now felt oppressive, heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to have stretched, grown longer and darker, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. Then he heard it, a faint creak from the floorboards near the door. He told himself it was just the old building settling. Then another creak, closer this time. To slow, unmistakable drag of something soft being pulled across the rough carpet. Daniel sat bolt upright in bed, his heart starting to pound against his ribs. Just old pipes. He whispered into the darkness, the sound of his own voice, a small, unconvincing comfort. But the sound didn't stop. It was a persistent, subtle noise, just on the edge of hearing. He fumbled for the remote and turned on the television. A blast of white noise and static filled the room. He turned the volume up, hoping the aggressive hum would drown out the other sound. It didn't. The soft dragging continued, a faint, rhythmic scraping behind the electronic buzz. Annoyance warred with a growing sense of unease. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath his feet, and walked to the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. He peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, bathed in the same dim, yellow light. No one on the floor. No late-night travelers. No cleaning carts. And yet, he was certain that something inside the room had moved. Daniel returned to the bed and tried to lie down again. He pulled the covers up to his chin, a childish gesture he hadn't made in years. He closed his eyes tight, trying to force the rationale part of his brain to take over. You're over. It's a strange place. You're imagining things. Then he heard it, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a whisper, low and deliberate, so close it felt like it was right beside his ear. Turn over! He froze, every muscle in his body tensing, his breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. No one else was there. The voice was raspy, dry, ancient, as if to punctuate the command. The bed shifted slightly beneath him, a subtle dip in the mattress, as though something unseen had just pressed its weight against it. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. Turn over! Slowly, reluctantly, Daniel complied. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, his hands trembling as he rolled onto his other side. He stared into the oppressive darkness of the room. Nothing happened. The silence returned, thick and absolute. He closed his eyes again, praying that this was all just a nightmare, that sleep would finally take him and release him from this waking terror. Minutes passed, or maybe it was an hour. He had lost all track of time. Then he felt, Italiano, a definite weight, settling at the foot of the bed. It wasn't pressing down. Not exactly. It was more like a presence, a focused, heavy attention. Watching. Waiting. The whisper returned, laced with a chilling possessiveness. Now you belong to me. Daniel's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. He snapped his eyes open, expecting to see a figure, a shape, anything. But the room was the same. The shadows were the same. The furniture was unmoved. Yet, he could feel it. The presence was still there, lingering, patient, and terrifyingly alive. All night, he lay awake, rigid with fear. Every time he dared to close his eyes, the whisper would return, a tormenting loop in the dark. Turn over. Turn over. Look behind you. Each command was a fresh wave of ice-cold dread. Never did. By the time the first gray light of morning seeped through a crack in the heavy curtains, Daniel was a wreck. He was utterly exhausted, but wired with adrenaline. He packed his bag in a frenzy, his hands shaking as he threw his clothes into his suitcase. He didn't even bother to shower. He left without breakfast, striding down the hallway as fast as he could without breaking into a full sprint, trying not to look back at the door of room 909. At the front desk, the same receptionist from the night before smiled brightly at him. "Did you sleep well, sir?" she asked, her voice cheerful. Daniel just stared at her, the question hanging in the air. He didn't respond. He couldn't. What would he even say? He simply turned and walked away. As he passed the large, ornate mirror on the elevator wall, he glanced at his own reflection. For a split second, a single, terrifying heartbeat. He saw something else. In the reflection of the hotel room he had just left, he thought he saw a figure lying at the foot of his now empty bed. A dark shadow, a distortion, in the reflection. Then, it was gone. Later that day, trying to shake off the night's horror, Daniel met a friend for coffee. He told her about the hotel, making it sound like a half-joke. "Room 909?" his friend asked, her voice suddenly quiet. Her smile faded. "Never stay there," she added, looking him straight in the eyes. "The people who do, they're never quite the same afterward." Daniel laughed, a short, nervous sound that didn't feel like his own. He didn't know if she was joking, or if she was giving him a serious warning. That night, Back in the supposed safety of his own apartment, hundreds of miles away, he tossed and turned in his familiar bed. He thought he was safe. He thought the hotel, the room, the memory was far behind him. Then, in the deep, quiet darkness of his own bedroom, he heard it again. The same dry, raspy whisper right beside his ear. Turn over. He didn't dare. He squeezed his eyes shut, his body rigid, praying for morning. And somewhere, miles and miles away, room 909 waited, the bed unmade. The shadows patient, and the whispered persistent, echoing in the empty space. Turn over, turn over, turn over. Waiting for its next guest, or maybe waiting for Daniel to finally obey. It all started on a quiet Sunday evening. Mara had just finished washing her hands when she looked up at the bathroom mirror. The light above the sink flickered, humming in a way she'd never really noticed before. She blinked. Her reflection blinked back. But it was late. Just a fraction of a second. So small, she almost dismissed it. I'm just tired, she murmured to herself, drying her hands and walking away without a second thought. The next time it happened, though, she was certain. She stood perfectly still in front of the mirror and slowly, deliberately, raised her right hand. Her reflection followed, but it was late again. A single, distinct heartbeat behind. Mara lowered her hand, her eyes locked on the glass. The reflection did the same, delayed, careful, as if it needed extra time to think about it. A cold prickle ran up her spine. She took a step back from the sink. The reflection stepped back to late. Mara tried to find a logical explanation. An old mirror, maybe. Bad lighting. Simple eye strain from a long week. But none of it could explain the unsettling feeling that started to follow her every time she left the bathroom, that she was being watched from behind the glass. That night, she dreamed she was standing in front of the mirror, but her reflection remained perfectly still, smiling gently, as if it was waiting for her permission to move. She woke up with her heart pounding in her chest. The delay grew longer. First, it was a full second, then two. Mara found herself testing it obsessively, a morbid curiosity taking over. She'd smile, the reflection would smile back. A moment later, she'd frown. The reflection would frown too, but not quite in the same way. Its eyes seemed to linger on her face, studying her, almost as if it was learning. One evening, standing there in the dim bathroom light, she noticed something even more terrifying. Her reflection was breathing, but she was not. She held her breath, her lungs burning, and watched in horror as the reflection continued to inhale and exhale. Slow and calm, a small patch of fog appeared on the glass, originating from the other side. Mara staggered back, a gasp escaping her lips. No, she whispered. The reflection's lips moved. The sound came a few seconds late, a distorted echo of her own voice. Don't rush me. That was the last straw. Mara stopped using the mirror. She brushed her teeth with her eyes squeezed shut. She covered every reflective surface in her apartment with towels and sheets. She even started avoiding her phone screen when it was dark. But it didn't matter. She could still feel it. Waiting. Patiently catching up. On the seventh night, the power went out. The apartment was plunged into an unnerving, silent darkness. Mara fumbled for her phone, its screen lighting the room with a faint, ghostly glow. She didn't mean to. It was just instinct. She opened the camera app, turning it to the front-facing view. The screen showed her face, illuminated by the phone's light. For a split second, it was perfectly still. Then, the reflection moved. But it wasn't delayed this time. It moved first. A scream tore from Mara's throat as she dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the light dying, leaving her in absolute blackness. And in that suffocating silence, she heard it. The soft creak of glass, like something stretching after a long, cramped sleep. Then footsteps. They sounded like her own, but they were out of rhythm with her frantic heartbeat. When the power flickered back on a few moments later, the mirror in the bathroom was empty. No cracks, no smudges, and no reflection. Who's the smooth, clean sheet of glass? Waiting. The next morning, Mara found herself standing in front of the mirror again. This time, the reflection moved perfectly in sync with her. Almost too perfectly. She forced a smile. The reflection smiled back, but wider, its eyes unblinking, fixed on her. Later that day, her neighbor passed her in the hallway and frowned. "You look different," he said, a note of confusion in his voice. Mara tilted her head slightly, a movement that felt just a heartbeat too late. "I feel fine," she replied, her voice smooth and steady. That night, somewhere behind the glass, someone had finally caught up, and someone else was left behind, waiting in the dark. The house was just too cheap to be true. Clara and her husband, Mark, had driven hours to see it, fully expecting to find decay, mold, or some other hidden flaw that explained the price. Instead, it looked almost perfect. A cozy brick structure, small but incredibly charming, with a garden that looked like it had been tended to just yesterday. "It's a steal," Mark said, a wide smile spreading across his face. Clara nodded, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach, but she couldn't deny the appeal of saving so much money. They moved in on a gray, quiet afternoon. The sky, the color of slate. They spent the day unloading boxers, arranging furniture, turning the empty shell into a home. Everything felt so wonderfully ordinary. Warm, safe. The first night passed without a single incident, but the next morning, as Clara scrolled through the photos she'd taken during the move, she noticed something strange. Her family smiled back at her in every single shot. There was Mark in the living room, their kids in the garden, a selfie of all of them by the front door. But the house itself, it was completely missing. Just a void behind them. She frowned, showing the phone to Mark. He let out a nervous laugh. "It's probably just the light, the angle, something weird with the camera." Clara wasn't convinced. As the days ticked by, every photo she took showed the same impossible thing. Her family was there, crystal clear, but the rooms, the garden, the porch hall, gone. A blank space where their home should be, except for one photo. One she hadn't taken intentionally. It just appeared on her phone one evening. It showed the house, empty. No one inside, just the silent, vacant building. At night, Clara started to feel the change first, as a quiet, low hum in her ears. The air in the rooms felt thicker, heavier. The shadows seemed to move differently, stretching and shrinking in the corners of her eyes. Sometimes, she swore she could hear the floorboards creak overhead when she knew nobody was walking there. Mark didn't notice any of it. He worked long hours, and when he was home, he was exhausted. He just called it stress, telling her she needed to relax. But Clara couldn't stop noticing. One evening, after the kids were in bed, she picked up her camera and began photographing the rooms again, a desperate need for proof gnawing at her. The images that appeared on the small screen were the same. Her family in the foreground, smiling in older pictures she'd placed on the mantel, but behind them, empty walls, missing furniture. The house, it seemed, only existed when you weren't looking directly at it, when you weren't trying to capture it. She began sleeping lightly, her ears tuned to the house's subtle noises. She'd wake to phantom creaks, two walls that seemed to shift just slightly in the moonlight, two doorways that looked wider than they should have been. The oddest thing, though, was the garden. During the day, it was a normal, beautiful space. But at night, when she looked out her window, she saw the same familiar path she had walked 1,000 times. But now, it seemed to lead somewhere else entirely. One night, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, she followed it. Barefoot, she stepped onto the cool grass and walked toward a faint glow at the very edge of the lawn. As she got closer, she saw it, a shadowy outline of her family, all of them standing together, smiling, but their shapes were empty. Hollow, a cold dread washed over her, and she ran back inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. About a week after they moved in, Mark came home early from work. "Clara, where are all those weird photos you were talking about?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She handed him her camera without a word. He scrolled through the gallery. The images were suddenly ordinary. There was the living room, the garden, the family. Everything was visible, solid, and perfectly normal. Mark smiled. Relieved? See? Everything's fine. I told you, you're just imagining things. But Clara knew better. She could feel the house watching her. A silent, heavy presence all around. That night, she woke to the sound of quiet breathing. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Mark's. It was slow, deep, and it seemed to come from the very walls of the room. The house itself seemed alive. Pressing close, waiting, she slipped out of bed, her feet silent on the floor, and tried leaving the bedroom. The hallway stretched on, longer than it should. The door to the living room gone. The rooms she had just walked through that day had vanished. The photos didn't lie. The house appeared, but only on its own terms. Weeks turned into a month. Then, too, Clara tried taking the car to go to the store, to visit a friend, to just get away. But every street she turned down seemed wrong. Every corner led her back to the same quiet neighborhood, the same driveway, and the same house that refused to be captured in photos. Mark kept telling her she was stressed, that she needed to see someone. Clara stopped arguing. There was no point, but at night, when the lights went out, the house came alive. It breathed. It waited. It quietly rearranged itself while she slept, the geography of her home a shifting puzzle she could never solve. And sometimes, in the pale glow of her phone screen, she thought she saw shadows moving in the background of her photos just beyond where the camera's lens could fully capture them. Clara never left the house again. And if someone were to drive past that quiet neighborhood today, they might see a charming brick house, its windows glowing softly in the twilight. A perfect family home. But in every photo, every memory, the house remains elusive. Sometimes you see the family smiling out at you. Sometimes you see nothing at all. And sometimes, if you look long enough, it feels like the house is looking back. Leo had always been a heavy sleeper. The kind of person who could sleep through a thunderstorm without even stirring. But that all changed the day his little sister Emma moved into her new room, the one right next to his. The first few nights were normal, filled with the usual house sounds and the distant hum of the city. But then the whispers started. It was always late, long after their parents had gone to bed. A small, trembling voice would drift from Emma's room. "Leo, are you awake?" He'd groan, rolling over. "What is it, Em?" Her reply was always the same, a tiny thread of fear in the dark. "There's something under my bed." The first time she said it, he chuckled. He got up, walked into her room, and dramatically knelt down. "See, monsters aren't real, Em." He lifted the dust ruffle, revealing nothing but a lost sock and a few dust bunnies. "Just look under, see, nothing there." But she would shake her head, her big eyes wide with the fear he didn't understand. "Don't look, Leo. He watches when you do." He frowned, ruffling her hair. "It's just your imagination, kiddo. Go to sleep." He went back to his room, dismissing it as a childish fantasy, a story she'd cooked up to get attention. The first night, after their little ritual, it was quiet. The second night, he stayed up later than usual, scrolling through his phone, the blue light casting long shadows on his wall. The house was silent, except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Then, at exactly 2:03 a.m., a faint sound reached him. It was a soft, dry scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. He froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. He strained his ears, listening. It came again, a little closer this time. Then, Emma's whisper. So quiet, he almost missed it. "He moves when I'm awake." Leo's heart gave a little jolt. He told himself it was just the old house settling, the pipes groaning, pulling the covers up to his chin, trying to force the unease away. The third night, curiosity gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He waited until the house fell silent, then tiptoed into Emma's room. She was sitting up in bed, a small silhouette against the moonlit window. She didn't say a word, just watched him. He took a deep breath, knelt down beside her bed, and leaned over, peering into the darkness underneath. There was nothing, just the familiar emptiness. He was about to pull back, about to tell her she was being silly, when a felt Italiano, a soft, warm puff of air against his cheek. It wasn't a draft, it was a breath, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close, right beneath him. He scrambled back, his breath catching in his throat. "See," Emma said softly from the bed, her voice devoid of its usual fear, replaced by a strange calmness. "He's awake now." Leo's heartbeat hammered against his ribs. He stood up, his eyes darting around the darkened room. "Who is?" he managed to ask, his own voice a strained whisper. Emma's voice trembled slightly, just a hint of the fear returning. "The man above the bed." Leo froze. His mind reeled. Above the bed? What did that even mean? He looked at the ceiling. It was just plain, white plaster. He looked at Emma, then back at the space under the bed. The feeling of that warm breath still lingered on his skin. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected any of this. That night, he couldn't bring himself to leave her. He pulled a chair from her desk and sat in the corner. The lights dimmed, but not completely off. He was determined to watch, to prove to himself that this was all some elaborate game of the mind. The clock on her nightstand ticked with agonizing slowness. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. The room felt smaller, claustrophobic, as if something was crouched just at the edge of his vision. Emma lay perfectly still in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Then he heard it again. A soft shuffle, not from the hallway, not from outside, but from directly beneath him. A presence that didn't belong, shifting in the shadows. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "Show yourself." Silence. The room was so still, he could hear his own frantic pulse. Then, the bed dipped. It was a slight, almost imperceptible movement, as if a heavy weight had shifted on it without any visible cause. A faint ethereal whisper seemed to float up from the floorboards, curling around him like smoke. "Don't look." Over the next week, the strange occurrences became a nightly ritual. The pattern was always the same. Long after midnight, Emma would hear it moving. The bed would shift subtly. He started finding things that weren't there in the daylight long. Thin scratches in the carpet under the bed, like something had been dragging itself back and forth. Leo couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't a child's imagination. He tried staying awake all night, every night, keeping a constant vigil. He'd sit in that chair, his eyes burning from exhaustion, trying to catch it, sometimes, in the deepest part of the night. When the shadows were at their darkest, he thought he saw it. A shape, denser than the surrounding blackness, crouched under the bed. It wasn't solid, more like a patch of void. And in that void, he'd sometimes see two small pinpricks of something even darker than the night, watching him. It never moved when the lights were on. It only existed in the twilight, in the space between waking and sleeping. T-moment AD, flick on a lamp. The shape would vanish. The feeling of being watched would dissipate, leaving him alone in the quiet room with his pounding heart. One night, exhausted and terrified, Leo finally asked the question he had been avoiding, the one that felt too real to speak aloud. He knelt by Emma's bed, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" Emma, who had been lying still, turned her head to look at him. In the dim light from the hallway, he could see tears glistening on her cheeks. "He wants someone to play with," she whispered, her voice cracking, "but only when you sleep." A cold shiver snaked its way down Leo's spine, as if in response to her words. The presence under the bed seemed to react. A low, soft vibration ran through the floorboards, up through the legs of the bed, and into his hand that was resting on the mattress. "He's been lonely for a very, very long time," Emma said, her voice dropping to an unnerving monotone. "And now you can't live." Leo's hands grew clammy. He finally understood. She wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't making it up. The dark shape under the bed shifted slightly, more definitively this time, and from the deepest part of the shadow, A hand reached out. It was long, thin, and unnaturally pale, its fingers like spider legs stretching toward the edge of the dust ruffle, just barely visible before it retracted back into the darkness. He never told their parents. How could he? Mom, Dad, there's a man made of shadows living under Emma's bed, and another one on the ceiling. They would think he was losing his mind. They would send him to a doctor, tell him he was just stressed, not sleeping enough. They wouldn't believe him. So, his life changed. Every night, he would go into Emma's room after their parents were asleep. He'd lie on the floor beside her bed, a thin blanket his only comfort. Listening to the whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the soft scraping under the bed, the occasional soft thump of weight moving just beneath where his sister slept, and the strange part, Emma slept peacefully through it all. Now that he was there, she was no longer afraid. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would whisper to him without opening her eyes, as if speaking in her sleep. "Don't make any noise, Leo. Don't wake him. He likes it when it's quiet." And in the suffocating stillness of the night, surrounded by the breathing darkness, Leo finally understood the terrifying truth. Emma had been right all along. There was someone under the bed, and her cryptic words about the man above the bed suddenly made a horrifying new kind of sense. He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was on it, a mirror to the thing below. He was trapped between them. A silent guardian, a nightly sacrifice. He was part of their strange, silent world now, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that he would never, ever be a heavy sleeper again. The bus arrived 5 minutes late. It always did. Ethan stood alone at the stop, the streetlights humming softly above him, their glow fading in and out like tired eyes. The city was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the deep, empty quiet that only exists after midnight, when the world seems to be holding its breath. The sign beside him was a stark reminder. Last route, minus 12:40 a.m. When the bus finally appeared, it did so without headlights. It didn't emerge from the distant haze with a familiar beam of light. It simply materialized out of the darkness, rolling to a gentle, silent stop right in front of him. The doors opened with a long, drawn-out sigh, like an old man settling into a chair. Ethan hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The air inside the bus was warm, uncomfortably warm for this time of night, thick and still. He glanced around. The seats were empty. All of them. Rouse-a-backened, worn vinyl stared back at him. The driver sat perfectly motionless behind the wheel, his back ramrod straight, his hands resting calmly at 10 and 2. His uniform was immaculate, crisp, and untouched by wear, as if it were his first day on the job, not his last run of the night. "Evening," Ethan said, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the silence. The driver gave a single, curt nod but didn't speak or turn around. The doors hissed closed, sealing Ethan inside with the oppressive warmth. The bus began to move, pulling away from the curb with an unnerving smoothness. At the first stop, no one was waiting. The bus slowed anyway. The door's side opened, revealing an empty sidewalk bathed in the sickly orange glow of a street lamp. Nothing happened. A few seconds passed. Then the doors closed. They continued on. Stop after stop passed, in the exact same way empty sidewalks. Silent intersections, the bus stopping for no one and for no reason. A knot of unease began to form in Ethan's stomach. He pulled out his phone, hoping for a distraction, a connection to the normal world. The screen was blank. No signal, no time, just a dead black mirror reflecting his own worried face. He tried the power button. Nothing. After what felt like 20 minutes of this silent, pointless journey, the unease blossomed into genuine anxiety. He had to break the silence. "Does anyone usually get on this late?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Without turning his head, the driver finally spoke. His voice was low and even. "They used to." The simple answer sat heavy in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Ethan glued his eyes to the window, watching the city slide past. But something was wrong. The scenery felt. Off he saw a familiar cafe with a neon sign that flickered in a distinct pattern. A few minutes later, he saw it again. Tasame Cafe, the same flickering sign. Then came a closed bookstore with a painted mural on its side. And again. And again. He saw the same traffic light, stuck on a flashing yellow, Aubert and Aubert. They were driving in a loop. Did we miss my stop? Ethan asked, his heart starting to hammer against his ribs. The driver slowed the bus, but not to a stop. No, he said calmly. We passed it. Ethan's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. Then why didn't you stop? I needed to get off there. The driver finally turned his head. His face was placid, his features ordinarily, but his eyes were pale, almost colorless. Empty? You didn't ask to get off? He said, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. The bus continued its journey, now veering off the familiar looped path and into an unfamiliar part of the city. The streetlights grew farther apart, casting long, distorted shadows. The buildings thinned out, replaced by dark, skeletal trees. The road narrowed until it was barely a single lane. The bus slowed to a crawl before finally coming to a halt. This is the last stop, the driver announced. The doors sighed open. Outside was not a street. It wasn't a bus depot or a recognizable landmark. It was a white, empty field beneath a starless, ink-black sky. A faint mist clung to the ground. Ethan stood up, his legs feeling weak. I think there's been a mistake. This isn't my stop. This isn't anyone's stop. The driver shook his head gently, a flicker of something like pity in his empty eyes. There always is, he said. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. The warm, stale air of the bus behind him, the cold, damp air of the field in front of him. He felt he had no choice. He stepped off the bus. The ground was soft beneath his shoes, like freshly tilled, damp earth. The doors hissed shut behind him, the sound echoing in the profound silence. The bus did not leave. Its engine hummed, a low, patient thrum in the night. Why am I here? Ethan called out, his voice trembling. The driver's voice, muffled but clear, came through the closed doors. Because you noticed. Ethan's brow furrowed. Noticed what? That you never saw anyone get on? The driver replied. That you never saw anyone get off. You noticed the loop. You questioned it. The bus lights, which had been dim, faded completely, leaving Ethan in near total darkness. His breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. A primal fear gripped him. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Through the glass, he could just make out the driver's silhouette. He saw the hint of a smile. Now, the driver's voice echoed. You wait. Ethan spun around, his eyes scanning the dark field. And then he saw them. In the far distance, shapes began to move. Slow, quiet, deliberate. They were approaching, figures stepping out of the darkness, forming a loose, shuffling line, a queue. It was a bus stop. They were all waiting. Ethan's chest tightened, constricting his breath. What are they? He whispered to the silent bus. The driver answered softly, his voice seeming to come from right beside him. They're ready. Ethan looked back at the bus. At the dark shape of the driver, his gaze met Ethan's. You can still ride, he said. The offer hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a black ocean. But next time, you'll drive? The doors opened once more, a silent invitation. The figures in the field were closer now, their featureless forms becoming clearer in the gloom. Ethan could almost hear their silent, patient breathing. He looked from the approaching line of passengers to the open door of the bus. He took a step forward. The doors closed. At the next stop, miles and miles away in the sleeping city, a lone figure waited beneath a flickering streetlight. A bus emerged from the darkness, rolling to a gentle stop. The doors opened with a long, familiar sigh, and someone new, with pale, empty eyes, stepped aboard to start their shift. Have you ever wondered what happens when you close your eyes at night? What secrets does the darkness hold? For Marcus's sleep had always been a simple, predictable thing. He'd close his eyes, drift off, and then morning would arrive. That was it. Simple, safe. But one night, a harmless bit of curiosity would shatter that safety forever. It all started with a podcast. The host was talking about sleep talking, how people sometimes reveal their innermost thoughts, things they don't even remember thinking. Marcus lived alone, so he chuckled at the idea. What was the worst that could happen? He might mumble something about work, or maybe a grocery list. So, he decided to try it. He set his phone on the nightstand, hit record, and let the soft red light watch over him as he drifted off. The next morning, brewing his coffee, he played the recording back. For a long time, there was nothing but the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He almost turned it off, dismissing the experiment as a bust. But then, at exactly 2:11 a.m., the sound changed. His breathing stopped completely. For 3 long, silent seconds. Then, his own voice, low and eerily clear, spoke into the darkness. "Don't enter the room." Marcus frowned, a chill prickling his skin despite the warm coffee mug in his hands. He didn't remember saying that. He didn't remember dreaming it. He leaned closer to the phone, listening intently. A few seconds of silence, then another sound. Footsteps, soft, bare feet padding across the wooden floor of his bedroom. His throat went dry. He lived alone. There was no one else in the apartment. There couldn't be. That night, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He told himself he was just being paranoid, that it was a creak in the old building, a sound from a neighbor. But he had to know for sure. He placed his phone on the nightstand again. He didn't admit to himself that it was fear driving him, just a need for proof. He pressed record. This time, sleep came unnervingly fast, pulling him under like a dark tide. The second recording was worse. Much worse. He fast-forwarded through the hours of silence, his heart pounding in his chest. At 1:47 a.m., his own voice whispered again, urgent and tense. "You're too early." A moment passed, and then a different voice responded. It wasn't his. It was a raspy, wet sound, something that felt too close to the microphone. "I know." Marcus dropped his phone. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. He replayed that single, terrifying word over and over. "I know." It was undeniably there, a voice that didn't belong. A voice that was in his room while he slept. That night, sleep was impossible. He didn't even try. He sat up in bed, eyes wide, staring into the oppressive shadows of his room, listening for any sound, any creak, any footstep. Then, at precisely 2:11 a.m., his phone screen lit up. The recording app had started on its own. The little red dot glowed, a malevolent eye, in the darkness. Marcus was frozen, too terrified to move, too terrified to stop it. He heard it then. The slow creak of his bedroom door opening. Not a loud sound, just a subtle shift, enough to let something in. He bolted upright in bed, his eyes darting around the room. It was empty. Nothing was there. But then he saw it. The closet door, which he always kept shut, was now slightly ajar. The recording captured his every panicked breath, the shallow gasps for air. It captured the soft rustle of fabric from inside the closet. And then the other voice returned, whispering from the phone's speaker, as if it was speaking right into the microphone. "He's listening." A cold sweat beaded on Marcus's forehead. He heard his own voice on the recording, a desperate whisper he didn't remember making. "I told you not to enter the room." There was a long, dreadful silence. Then, slow footsteps, not coming closer, but leaving. The bedroom door creaked shut. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, Marcus forced himself to listen to the rest of the recording. There was a section he hadn't heard before, time-stamped at 3:02 a.m. It was his voice again, but the tone was completely different. It was calm, resigned. "You can stay, just not too close." He tried to delete the file. His fingers shook as he tapped the screen. The file vanished, and he'd let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But then his computer screen flickered. The deleted file reappeared in the folder, as if it had never left. It was impossible. A cold dread seeped into his bones. This was something he couldn't erase, something he couldn't run from. That night, Marcus didn't bother with the recorder. What was the point? It was already here. It knew he was listening. He lay in bed, rigid, waiting. At 2:11 a.m., he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, making the air feel like a tomb. The mattress dipped slightly at the foot of the bed, as if someone or something had just sat down. Marcus held his breath, every muscle screaming for him to run. But he was paralyzed by fear. A voice, no longer from the phone but real, whispered directly beside his ear, its breath cold against his skin. "You don't remember inviting me." The voice was a dry rustle, ancient and knowing, but you did. The next morning, a new, unnamed audio file was on his phone. He hadn't created it. He played it, his hand shaking. It was a recording of the entire night. His panicked breathing, the dipping of the bed, the chilling whisper. But at the very end, there was one last line, spoken in his own voice. It was calm, serene, almost content. "You can enter the room now. Marcus doesn't fight it anymore. He still sleeps with the recorder on every single night. He listens to the footsteps, to the whispers, to the shifting presence in his room. He's not trying to catch it or prove it's real anymore. He's not trying to keep it out. He's recording to make sure it stays, because he has finally realized the most terrifying truth of all. He is more afraid of being alone with it than he is of what it might do. He invited it in, and now it's a part of his life. A silent roommate in the dark. And every night, the red light glows, a quiet promise between a man and his monster. The clock stopped at 2:44. At first, Nadia just thought it was broken. It was a simple bedside clock, a small digital thing she'd had for years. It flickered once, just a brief stutter, and then froze. The numbers 2:44 glowed faintly in the pitch-black room. She reached out, her fingers still clumsy with sleep, and tapped the plastic case. Nothing. The numbers remained, stubbornly fixed in time. Frowning, she grabbed her phone from the nightstand. The screen stayed completely dark. She pressed the power button, held it down, but it was useless. It was as if the battery had been ripped out. No signal, no time, nothing. An uneasy feeling started to creep up her spine. The room felt ... wrong. It was too quiet. Not just quiet, but silent. Absolutely silent. Nadia sat up in bed, listening intently. There was no familiar hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, no distant rumble of late-night traffic, not even the gentle whisper of wind against the window pane. The world outside her apartment seemed to have vanished. It was a complete and total absence of sound, a void. She swung her legs out of bed, the sudden chill of the wooden floor shocking her bare feet. She stood up and walked towards the hallway. The door to her bedroom was ajar. In fact, as her eyes adjusted, she realized every door in her apartment was open. The bathroom, the spare room, the closets, all slightly ajar, creating dark, gaping mouths in the walls. And all the lights were off. But here was the strangest part. She could see. She could see perfectly. The darkness wasn't really dark. It was a flat gray, static-like quality, as if she were inside a paused photograph. Every object was clear, defined, but stripped of its color and life. It was a world made of shades of gray. She took a breath, expecting the small sound to echo in the stillness, but it didn't. Her breath seemed to be swallowed by the silence the moment it left her lips. Her own existence felt muted, muffled. It was deeply unsettling. She moved toward the kitchen, her steps making no noise on the floor. The clock on the oven read 2:44. The one on the microwave, 2:44. It was undeniable now. Every single clock had stopped at the exact same moment. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, loud rhythm in the dead quiet. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded strange, distant, as if it were coming from the other end of a long tunnel. There was no reply, just that oppressive, heavy silence. Panic began to set in. She hurried to the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock. She turned to the deadbolt. It made a soft metallic click, but the door refused to budge. She pushed, she pulled, she rattled the knob. It was sealed shut, as if it were welded to the frame. The air around her suddenly felt thick, heavy, pressing against her skin like a physical weight, and that's when she saw it. A flicker of movement, so slow, so subtle, she almost missed it. At the far end of the hallway, near her bedroom door, stood a shape. It wasn't solid, not quite clear. It looked like a shadow that hadn't finished forming, a tear in the fabric of the gray world she was trapped in. It was tall and thin, and it just stood there, watching her. It didn't seem to be moving, but she felt its presence growing closer, more intense. Nadia took a stumbling step back, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you want?" she whispered, the words barely audible, even to herself. The shape responded. It didn't speak. It just tilted its head slightly, an unervingly curious gesture. And then it took a single, slow step forward. The sound of that one step was deafening. It echoed through the apartment, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the silent world. She turned and ran. Or she tried to. Her legs moved, her mind screamed at her to flee, but the world seemed to lag behind her. It was like trying to run through deep, thick water, every movement a tremendous effort. The air resisted her. Elder Buck, the shape, however, moved with an effortless grace. It glided through the stillness, unbound by the strange physics of this frozen moment. It was born from this place. It belonged here. As she struggled down the hallway, the wall clock flickered in her peripheral vision. Las 2:44. And las 2:44. And las 2:44. The numbers flashed erratically, a frantic, broken signal. The shape was closer now. It raised a long, spindly arm, and the very air around it seemed to bend and distort, like heat rising from pavement. In that instant, a horrifying realization washed over Nadia. Time hadn't stopped. She was the one who was frozen, caught between the ticks of a clock, trapped in the microscopic gap between 1 second and the next. And in this place, this in-between space, something else lived, something that had noticed her. The shape spoke, not with a voice, not with words. It spoke in pressure, a crushing weight inside her mind, a feeling. Stay. The command was simple, absolute. Nadia shook her head, tears of terror streaming down her face. No, she managed to choke out. The shape leaned in close. Its featureless face was inches from hers. "You always do." The pressure in her head intensified. She felt her body grow impossibly heavy, her limbs turning to lead. Her thoughts began to slow down, becoming syrupy and disjointed. Her frantic breathing started to match the profound stillness of the room, slowing, until it was almost non-existent. The shadow wrapped around her, not like an attack, but like a shadow merging with its source. It flowed into her, a cold, silent invasion. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The clock on her bedside table blinked. 2:45. The familiar, comforting hum of the refrigerator started up again. From the street below, she could hear the distant sound of a passing car. The world was normal again. The lights were on. The air was light. Nadia was back in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't moved. She hadn't screamed. She glanced at the clock. 2:45. It was just a minute. A single, lost minute. But she knew. She wasn't alone anymore. Something else was there now. A silent passenger within her. Something that had been waiting in the stillness between moments. Something that had learned how to wait. And now, every single night, at exactly 2:44 a.m., Nadia wakes up. And every night, something wakes up with her. It's patient. It knows it has all the time in the world. And it's just waiting. The footsteps began on the first night. They were soft, almost hesitant. Measured, slow. At first, Omar brushed them off. It had to be the person in the apartment upstairs. This building was old, the kind with thin ceilings and tired walls where every little sound traveled, weaving itself into the fabric of your life. He'd lived in places like this before. You get used to the symphony of your neighbors' lives, their arguments, their late-night TV, their pacing. It was just part of the city experience. But as he lay in bed, the sound started to feel different. It wasn't the random shuffling of someone getting ready for bed or grabbing a midnight snack. It was deliberate. A single footstep, a pause, then another. Omar frowned, trying to place the sound. It seemed to be coming from directly above his bedroom. He grabbed his phone, pulling up the digital copy of his lease. He scrolled through the documents, his thumb swiping across the screen until he found it. Unit description, top floor. A small chill snaked down his spine. Top floor. No one lived above him. There was nothing above him but the roof and the sky. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe it was the pipes, or the building settling, or maybe his ears were playing tricks on him in the dead of night. Eroit Ober, pulling the covers up to his chin, and forced himself to ignore it. The next night, Tay returned to Samesov, Measured. Footsteps, but this time they had a clear, unnerving pattern. Step, a long pause. Step, another pause. He started counting the seconds between each sound. The ticking of his alarm clock, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, methodical rhythm from above. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. 12 seconds. Every single time. Omar lay awake for hours, staring at the blank, white canvas of his ceiling, his ears straining in the silence, waiting for the next footstep to drop. It was like a form of slow-motion torture. The predictability of it was somehow worse than a random noise. It felt intentional. It felt like something was waiting. By the time the sun finally crept through his blinds, he hadn't slept a wink. His eyes were grainy and sore. His mind a fog of exhaustion and anxiety. He couldn't go on like this. He cornered the building caretaker, a tired-looking man named George, in the lobby the next morning. "Hey, George," Omar started, trying to sound casual. "Quick question. I've been hearing some noise above my apartment at night. It sounds like someone's walking around." George frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. He leaned on his broom, giving Omar a long look. "Above your apartment. Son, you're on the top floor." "I know. That's why it's so strange," Omar insisted. "It's very distinct, like footsteps." George shook his head slowly, a grim expression settling on his face. "There hasn't been anyone up there in years, not since the fire. That whole upper level was sealed off. It's just an empty, charred space under the roof." A fire. Omar felt a knot tightened in his stomach. He opened his mouth to ask, but then closed it. He didn't want to know the details. Knowing would only feed the growing dread that was starting to take root in his mind. It just nodded, thanked George, and walked away. The caretaker's words echoing in his head. Sealed. Charred space. Empty. That night, the footsteps felt closer. Louder. The sound seemed to bypass the ceiling entirely, vibrating through the very air in the room, through the bones in his skull, through his own shallow breathing. They weren't just walking across the floor anymore. They were pacing, back and forth, directly over his bedroom. It was the sound of someone waiting impatiently, of a caged animal wearing a groove into the floor. The rhythm was the same 12 seconds between each heavy tread, but the intensity was escalating. Omar couldn't stand it. He grabbed his pillow and blanket and fled to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. He hoped the change of location would offer some relief. But as he settled in, a new sound began. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Step, pause. Step. They had followed him. The pacing was now directly above the living room. Always above him. Always 12 seconds apart. Always patient. It knew where he was. On the fourth night, Omar decided he needed proof. He couldn't be going crazy. He set up his phone on the nightstand, hit record, and lay perfectly still in his bed. The footsteps started right on cue. A slow, heavy march across the sealed-off space above. He could hear them as clearly as if the person were in the room with him. He let the recording run for nearly an hour, capturing the relentless, maddening rhythm. The next morning, bleary-eyed and desperate, he played it back. He pressed his phone to his ear, cranking up the volume. Nothing. There was only the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the faint sound of his own breathing. He scrubbed through the entire audio file. Silence. Complete and utter silence. The phone hadn't picked up a single footstep, but he had heard them. No. Odd. The realization was a punch to the gut. This wasn't a sound that could be captured or explained. It was a sound just for him. And that made it infinitely worse. The feeling of being singled out, of being haunted by something no one else could perceive, was a new level of terror. He started leaving all the lights on when he went to sleep. The bright glare from every lamp and overhead fixture turned his apartment into an unnatural, shadowless space. It didn't help. The footsteps didn't seem to care about the light. In fact, they seemed to be aware of it. The pacing became more careful, the steps softer, as if whatever was up there was trying to be stealthy, trying to avoid being seen. Even though it was separated by a ceiling, it felt like it was observing him, learning his habits, adapting. Then, one night, the pattern changed. The familiar rhythm was broken. He heard a step, then another one right after it. Step, step, then a long, drawn-out pause. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Omar held his breath. Every muscle in his body tensed. What was it doing? The sound, when it came again, was not a footstep. It was a soft, dry scratching, and it wasn't coming from above the ceiling anymore. It was coming from inside it. Right over his head, a sound like long nails dragging slowly across old, dry plaster. Omar stared upward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, more absolute than before. "Hello," he whispered, his own voice a fragile, trembling thing in the quiet room. The scratching stopped instantly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a voice answered. It was muffled, distorted by the plaster and wood, but it was terrifyingly close. It was a dry, raspy whisper that seemed to slither right into his ear. "You moved my floor." The words made no sense, but the malice behind them was crystal clear. Omar's chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. He tried to sound brave, to assert his place. I live here," he stammered, his voice cracking. The ceiling above him let out a low, protesting creak. "You sleep here?" the voice corrected, its tone dripping with ancient possessiveness. "I walk here." And then the footsteps returned, but they were different now. Ebon angrier. Each step landed with a deafening thud that seemed to shake the entire room. Dust and tiny flecks of paint started to drift down from the ceiling, catching the light like malevolent snowflakes. He watched in horror as the plaster directly above his bed began to bulge downward, hoosed slightly as if something immense was pressing down on it from the other side. Something wanted to get through. Omar scrambled backward off the bed, stumbling toward the door, his eyes locked on the ceiling. The voice spoke one last time, no longer a whisper but a low, menacing growl that filled the apartment. "I don't like the way you listen." And then, absolute silence. The footsteps stopped. The pressure on the ceiling vanished. The air became still and heavy, an unnatural calm that was more terrifying than the noise. Omar stood frozen by the door, his hand on the knob, listening. He counted 1, 2, 3, all the way past 12. Nothing. Then, one single, final step. Not from the ceiling. Not from above. It came from inside the room, from the dark corner right behind him. Omar didn't scream. He didn't look back. He ripped the door open and ran. He bolted down the stairs, burst out into the cold night air. And he didn't stop running until the city lights blurred into a meaningless smear and his lungs burned with fire. He never went back. Not for his clothes, not for his laptop, not for anything. The apartment on the top floor remains sealed. The building still stands, quiet and unassuming. But sometimes, late at night, when the city holds its breath, the tenants on the lower floors report hearing strange noises. Faint footsteps, not from the apartment above them, but from right over their heads, just inside the ceiling. Pacing, waiting for someone new to sleep beneath its floor, waiting for someone else to listen. After his mother died, the nights became too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Empty. The kind of silence that echoes, that listens back. Yusuf stayed in the apartment they had shared. He couldn't bring himself to leave. It was familiar. It was home. More importantly, it was all he had left of her. Every object was exactly where she had left it. The worn armchair by the window, where she used to read for hours. The small, rickety table in the hallway with the bowl for keys she always forgot. Even now, if he closed his eyes and breathed in deep, he could still catch the faint, sweet scent of her perfume clinging to the curtains, a scent that never fully seemed to fade. It was a ghost of its own. During the day, the silence was manageable. The hum of the city outside, the distant sound of traffic, the neighbors moving about upstairs, all of it helped fill the void. He could keep himself busy, run errands, lose himself in work. But at night, when the world outside fell quiet, the silence inside the apartment would rise up to meet him. It felt like a living thing, a presence in the dark. It listened to his breathing, to the frantic beat of his own heart. And one night, it answered. The first time he heard her voice, Yusuf was hovering in that strange space between wakefulness and sleep. A soft, gentle whisper floated through the darkness. Yusuf. It was unmistakable. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was warm. It was soft. It was exactly as he remembered it. A perfect echo from his memory. "Mom?" he called out into the empty room, his own voice cracking. The only reply was the suffocating silence. He tried to reason with himself. It was just grief. It was memory playing tricks on a tired mind. His brain, desperate for comfort, was just manufacturing it. He lay back down, pulling the covers up to his chin, but sleep wouldn't come. The second night, the voice returned. This time, it wasn't a whisper in his ear. It came from down the hallway, clearer and more distinct. "Yusuf, come here!" It was an invitation, spoken in that patient tone she always used when she had something to show him. Without even thinking, he was on his feet, drawn by the irresistible pull of that sound. He walked out of his bedroom and into the dark hall. His hand hovered over the light switch, his fingers trembling. But then, another voice spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the apartment, from the very walls themselves. It was a single, sharp word. "Don't." Yusuf froze, his hand dropping from the switch. A cold dread, completely different from his grief, washed over him. The first voice, his mother's voice, called out again. A little more insistent this time, a hint of impatience in it. "I'm waiting." Torn, confused, he flicked on the light. The hallway was empty. The familiar photos on the wall stared back at him. Silent witnesses. But the apartment felt different. Colder. That night, for the first time in his life, he locked his bedroom door. Over the following days, the voice grew bolder, clearer. It didn't just call his name anymore. It spoke to him. It started calling him by his childhood nickname, Sufi, something no one else had ever called him. It used phrases only his mother would know, inside jokes they had shared. It spoke with a perfect imitation of her love. Her concern, "Did you eat today, Sufi?" It would ask from the kitchen as he stared at a blank TV screen. "Don't stay up so late. You'll be tired for work." It would chide gently from the direction of her empty armchair. The first time he answered back, the tears came without warning. "I miss you," he whispered to the empty room. His voice choked with sobs. The voice paused, as if considering his words. Then it softened, full of a counterfeit sympathy. "I know, my love. I miss you, too." But the warnings continued as well. They were always quiet, always urgent, cutting through the comforting illusion. "Don't follow it. That's not her. It's lying." Yusuf never saw who spoke those words. He only knew the voice was ragged, inhuman, and filled with a desperate intensity. It was a battle for his attention, a war being fought in the silence of his apartment, and he was caught in the middle. He started talking to her more and more. It was easier than facing the crushing reality of her absence. He'd tell her about his day. He'd ask for advice, and she would always answer, her voice a soothing balm on the raw wound of his grief. He began to ignore the other voice, pushing the warnings away as a product of his own fear, his own disbelief that this miracle could be real. He wanted it to be real. He needed it to be. One night, as he lay in bed talking to the presence in the dark, the locked doorknob to his bedroom began to jiggle. He fell silent, listening. The rattling stopped. Then, with a soft click, the lock turned. The door swung open on its own, bathing the floor in a sliver of pale moonlight from the hallway window. Yusuf lay perfectly still, holding his breath. Slow, deliberate footsteps approached his bed. The familiar voice whispered, "So close now, it felt like it was right beside his ear. I'm right here with you." Sufi Yusuf's breath caught in his throat. It felt so real. The air was thick, heavy. But then, the other voice spoke, sharp and clear inside his head. "Look at the shadow." With a will that wasn't his own, Yusuf's eyes flickered open. In the doorway, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood a shape. It had his mother's outline, her height, the way she held her shoulders, the soft curve of her hair. It was her. But the shadow it cast on the floor, it was wrong. It didn't match. It stretched too long, grotesquely elongated, bending at impossible angles on the floor and up the wall. It was a dark, spidery thing, completely alien to the gentle form that cast it. "Why won't you come to me?" the voice asked. And for the first time, it sounded wrong. There was a hurt, lonely quality to it, a desperate, cloying need that hadn't been there before. The shadow twitched and moved closer, seeming to pull the figure along with it. The air grew heavy, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. With his heart pounding in his ears, Yusuf found his voice. It came out as a trembling whisper. "If you're really her, tell me something only we know." The shape paused. The voice hesitated. The silence stretched. And in that hesitation, Yusuf knew. Then it replied, its voice full of a cloying sweetness. "You loved me with all your heart." Yusuf felt a final, cold wave of clarity wash over him. He slowly shook his head on the pillow. "That's not it," he said, his voice stronger now. Everyone knew that. The other voice, the true voice, spoke one last time, a sense of grim finality in its tone. "Now you see." At his words, the lights in the room flickered violently. The shape in the doorway shuddered. It let out a sound that wasn't a voice, but a dry, rattling hiss, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It collapsed inward, folding into itself, the form of his mother dissolving, as the monstrous shadow seemed to devour it, pulling it down into the floor until there was nothing left. And then, silence. A real, profound silence. The room went still. The voice, his mother's voice, never returned. The apartment felt empty again, truly, finally empty. The comforting presence was gone, but so was the menacing one. He was just alone. The grief was still there, a dull, heavy ache in his chest, but it was clean now, untainted by the terrible hope and the chilling fear that had haunted him. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is asleep and the silence creeps back in, Yusuf thinks he hears something whisper his name from a dark corner of the room. But it's different now. It never, ever sounds like her anymore. The Tao was already there when Anna moved in. It sat on a small wooden chair in the corner of the bedroom, its porcelain face smooth and pale, its glass eyes reflecting light even in the dark. The landlord had mentioned it casually. Previous tenant left it behind. He'd said didn't want it. Anna didn't like dolls, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt rude, as if the doll were listening. The first night, Anna placed the doll facing the wall. She slept poorly, tossing and turning in the unfamiliar bed. When she woke in the morning, a sliver of sunlight cutting through the blinds, the doll had turned around. Its empty glass eyes were fixed on the bed. She told herself it was nothing. Old floors shift in old houses. The chair wasn't stable. Gravity does strange things at night. She turned the doll back toward the wall and went to work, the unsettling image lingering in her mind. That evening, she returned to find the doll closer to her bed. Not by much, just enough to be certain. A cold knot formed in her stomach. On the third night, Anna woke. Suddenly, it wasn't a sound that startled her. It was a feeling, the deep, primal sense of being watched. She lay perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to the frantic rhythm of her own breathing. The room was silent. Too silent. Too careful. She forced her eyes open. The doll stood at the foot of the bed. The small wooden chair in the corner was empty. Anna did not move. She did not scream. She told herself she was dreaming. A vivid nightmare brought on by stress. The next morning, the doll was back on the chair, facing her, as always. Anna bought a small security camera that afternoon. She placed it on the bookshelf, positioning it so it had a clear view of the bed and the doll in the corner. "If this is all in my imagination," she said out loud, her voice trembling slightly, "then I'll prove it." The doll, of course, did not respond. Its painted smile remained fixed. That night, Anna slept with the light on. Her dreams were shallow, fragmented things, full of shadows and whispers. She woke often, each time her eyes darting to the corner. And every time she looked, the doll was still, patient. In the morning, bleary-eyed from a lack of real rest, Anna reviewed the footage. Most of the video was just a still frame of her room. Her slow, rhythmic breathing was the only sound. Then, at 3:08 a.m., the image on the screen changed. The doll's head turned. Slowly, carefully. Anna's stomach tightened into a painful knot. The doll stood up. The movement was unnervingly quiet, fluid, and precise. It stepped down from the chair and began to walk toward the bed. The camera shook slightly as Anna shifted in her sleep on the recording. The doll froze, waited. Anna's eyes, on the screen, were closed. The doll moved again, one tiny porcelain foot after the other. Anna stopped the video. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely control the mouse. She skipped ahead. The footage ended abruptly. The camera had been knocked over, showing only the ceiling. That night, Anna did not sleep. She sat propped up against the headboard, a blanket pulled up to her chin, watching the doll. The doll did not move. Its eyes reflected her own fear back at her, calm and unblinking. At some point, sheer exhaustion took over. Her heavy eyelids closed. Just for a moment, she woke to the sensation of soft fabric brushing against her skin. The doll sat beside her on the bed, so close she could smell old dust and something faintly, sickly sweet. It leaned toward her ear. "You're very still when you sleep," it whispered in a voice like rustling leaves. "Anna, screamed." The lights in the room flickered on. The doll was back in the chair, facing her. The next day, Anna packed a single bag. She carried the doll to the front door, her hands shaking as she turned the knob. The hallway outside was empty. She set the doll down on the floor, stepped back inside, and slammed the door shut. When she turned around, her heart pounding against her ribs, the doll was inside the apartment again, seated on its chair, waiting. Anna no longer sleeps at home. She stays with friends, in cheap motels, anywhere but there. But every night, when she closes her eyes, she feels it. She feels the doll's presence, counting her breaths, patient, waiting for her to forget, because the doll only moves when you sleep. The road was supposed to be simple. A straight drive home, no turns, no traffic, just an empty highway and the low hum of tires against asphalt. Adele liked driving at night. The world felt quieter then, thinner, as if reality itself had stepped back to rest. The dashboard clock read 1:26 a.m. He had been on this stretch for what felt like forever. Just him, his car, and the two beams of light cutting through the darkness, the familiar comfort of the driver's seat, the steady rhythm of the engine. It was all he needed. After about 20 minutes of this hypnotic driving, Adele noticed the tree. It was a tall, twisted thing on the right side of the road, its branches reaching out like frozen hands against the inky sky. He didn't think much of it the first time. Just a peculiar landmark in an otherwise featureless landscape. It was strange, sure, but not unsettling. Not yet. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator. The miles rolled by, or at least they were supposed to. But after another 10 minutes of driving, there it was again. The summit. 3. The same twisted shape. The same slight bend in the road just before it. Adele frowned, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "That's not possible," he whispered, the words sounding small and weak in the confines of his car. He glanced at his GPS. It showed his car icon, stationary, even though the scenery was moving. He tapped the screen, but it was frozen. He checked the fuel gauge. Still full, exactly where it was when he started. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The radio, which had been playing some forgotten late-night talk show, crackled softly, then settled into a persistent hissing static. There was no other station, just the sound of a dead channel. Adele kept driving. What else could he do? The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by his headlights. The white lines on the asphalt seemed to repeat themselves, a pattern he was beginning to know by heart. And then, inevitably, the tree appeared again. This time, it felt closer. Its silhouette was sharper, more defined against the darkness. It was as if it was waiting for him. Adele slowed the car, the hum of the engine dropping to a low growl. The air outside felt thick, heavy, as if the night itself were pressing in on the thin metal shell of his vehicle. He pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of the tires sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. He turned off the engine, and the world went completely silent. To complete, there were no crickets, no rustle of wind, nothing. Just a profound, absolute stillness that felt wrong. His heart thumping against his ribs, Adele stepped out of the car. The air was cold, but there was no breeze. He walked toward the tree, his footsteps the only sound in this dead world. Up close, its bark was strangely pale and smooth, almost like polished bone under the moonlight, and carved into it were faint marks. Scratches. As he looked closer, he realized they looked like they were made by fingernails. Frantic, desperate scratches. And there were names. Most of them were blurred and faded, worn away by time or whatever forces governed this place. But one was clear. Chillingly clear. His name? Adele? He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, a gasp stolen by the silent air. "No," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "This isn't real. This is a dream." He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping to wake up in his bed, the memory of his nightmare already fading. But when he opened them, the tree was still there, and so was his name. Panic took hold. He scrambled back into the car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking. He turned the ignition, the engine roaring back to life, a welcome, familiar sound. In the oppressive silence, he stomped on the gas, tires spitting gravel as he swerved back onto the road. He drove faster now, much faster. The speedometer needle climbed, but the sense of speed felt muted, as if he were running through water. The headlights flickered once, twice, then the road bent gently, the same gentle bend he had taken 3 times before. And at the end of the curve, the tree appeared, directly ahead, blocking the road. But this time, something was different. This time, there was a car parked beneath it, the same model as his, the same dark color. His car, the engine, was off. The driver's door hung open, a silent invitation into the darkness. Adele's breath caught in his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt, just yards away from the other vehicle. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his chest. Slowly, as if in a movie, the parked car's interior light turned on, casting a pale, ghostly glow. Inside, a man was sitting. His hands were on the wheel. His head was tilted slightly to the side. Waiting, Adele realized then that the road wasn't looping. It was narrowing. It was a funnel, guiding him closer each time, stripping away his options, his hope, his sense of reality. The man in the parked car lifted his head. Their eyes met across the short distance, and the man smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was a knowing smile, a tired smile, a smile of recognition. And in that instant, Adele understood. He was looking at himself. A sudden, strange calm washed over him. The fear drained away, replaced by a quiet, resigned acceptance. He pulled his car over neatly beside the other one and turned off the engine for the last time. The road behind him vanished into the darkness. The tree loomed over them, its branches like a silent, watchful guardian. Adele stepped out of his car. The other Adele opened his door and stepped out too. They stood facing each other beneath the twisted branches, two identical figures in the dead of night. The air was still. "You took longer this time," the other Adele said, his voice gentle, familiar. Adele swallowed, the sound echoing in the silence. "What happens now?" The other Adele smiled that same, knowing smile. "Now," he said, gesturing to the car he had just left. "The car with the open door. You drive?" The car door closed. The engine started. The road stretched ahead once more, a black ribbon into infinity. And far in the distance, a twisted tree waited. It always started the same way. A whisper, so faint, so incredibly soft, it barely disturbed the quiet of your room. "Stay awake." Most nights, you dismissed it. You convinced yourself it was just your own voice, a stray thought drifting through that hazy fog between being awake and falling asleep. You'd ignore it, let your heavy eyelids close, and surrender to the night. But that was when the dreams changed. At first, they felt ordinary, deceptively normal. You'd find yourself in familiar rooms from your own life, bathed in a soft, diffused light. The sounds around you all muted and distant. But there was always something fundamentally wrong, something deeply unsettling. You were never in them. You never saw your reflection, never saw your hands. You only saw the spaces you had just left, the empty bed with the covers still rumpled, the doorway standing open into a dark hallway, the corner of the room where the shadows gathered just a little too thick, a little too dark. And every single night, the whisper would return. Each time, it felt closer, more insistent. "Stay awake." The words weren't a suggestion anymore. They were a command, a desperate plea. You started to try. You really did. You'd leave the lights on, burning bright against the encroaching darkness. You'd scroll endlessly on your phone, the blue light stinging your tired eyes, hoping the constant stream of content would keep your mind anchored to the waking world. You'd lie in bed and count your breaths, one after another, a metronome against the crushing silence. But sleep always came. It was inevitable. It crept up on you, a slow, warm tide you couldn't fight, no matter how hard you struggled. And that's when you felt it begin to wake up. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was slow, careful, calculated. You never saw it open its eyes. You never heard it move. But you could feel the entire room adjust to its awareness. The air itself grew heavier, pressing down on you. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was leaning in, listening. The very atmosphere in the room shifted, as if holding its breath, waiting. One night, you resisted longer than you ever had before. Your eyes burned with a dry, sandy fire. Your thoughts, once sharp and focused, now drifted aimlessly, unmoored and slow. And then, the whisper came again. But this time, it sounded different. There was a hint of relief in it, almost approval. "Good," it said. "The sound right next to your ear now. You're learning what?" The question formed in your mind, but you didn't ask. You were simply too tired, too exhausted to form the words. The next morning, you woke with a profound, chilling feeling that you hadn't been alone. It wasn't just a dream. The sheets were warmer on the other side of the bed, a residual heat that didn't belong to you. The pillow right beside your head was indented, a perfect shallow curve, as if someone or something had been lying there, watching you sleep, breathing with you, their rhythm matching yours in the dead of night. The nights that followed became a strange sort of classroom. The whisper became your teacher. It taught you small, subtle things, how to stay just on the edge of awareness, floating in the space between sleep and consciousness. It taught you how to listen without moving a muscle, how to perceive the room with your mind even when your eyes were closed. It taught you how to let your body fall into a state of rest while your mind remained open, a vigilant, silent observer. If you sleep fully, it warned one night, the voice now sharp and serious, I take your place. You didn't understand what that meant. Not at first. The idea was too abstract, too impossible to grasp. It sounded like a line from a ghost story, not a real threat. But the warning echoed in the quietest parts of your mind, a constant, low thrum of fear. You told yourself it was just a nightmare, a recurring stress dream. But a part of you knew it was more than that. And then, one night, you made a mistake. You were exhausted from a long day. Your defenses were down. You didn't fight it. You didn't even try. You fell into a deep, dreamless, heavy sleep. The change was instantaneous. The familiar hum of the room vanished. The whisper stopped, and in the absolute, total silence that followed, something else inhaled. A deep, rattling breath that wasn't yours. You woke up with a violent surge of adrenaline, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. But you couldn't move. Your body lay perfectly still, a leaden weight, impossibly heavy and distant. You were awake. Your mind was screaming, but you were not in control. You were a prisoner in your own skull. From the corner of the room, from that spot where the shadows were always the thickest, something stood up. It was tall, patient. It wore the shape of a person, a silhouette that had learned how to perfectly pretend. It stepped toward the bed, its movements silent and fluid. It sat on the edge, the mattress dipping under its weight. You felt its presence, a cold spot spreading through the blankets. It reached out a handur handen, adjusted the covers around your still form. It's easier this way, it whispered, and the sound froze the blood in your veins. It was your voice, your exact voice, but filled with a chilling, calm satisfaction. Ju rest. Ju rest y continue. You tried to scream, to fight, to do anything, but your mouth didn't move. Your limbs wouldn't obey. You were a phantom, a ghost trapped just behind your own eyes, watching a stranger pilot your body. Morning came. Sunlight streamed through the window, filling the room with a cheerful, mocking light. Your body rose from the bed. It moved naturally, stretching its arms. It walked to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and smiled your smile. But the eyes looking back weren't just yours anymore. Behind them, you were still there, watching, screaming into a void, as the whisper finally faded into a quiet, contented silence. So, the next time you feel that heavy pull of sleep, the next time your eyes start to close, whose dream? Before you fall asleep, something else is waiting to wake up. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a winter night. It was watchful, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Adam had lived near this forest his entire life. He knew its paths, its sounds, all its hidden dangers. He'd explored every inch of it since he was a kid. But this particular night, something felt wrong. The cold was sharper. The silence was louder. Fresh snow had fallen earlier that evening, a perfect, untouched blanket covering the ground. There was no wind, no animals stirring, just an absolute, unnerving stillness. It was just after midnight when Adam decided to go for a short walk. He told himself he'd only be a few minutes, just to clear his head. The cold air burned his lungs as he stepped onto the narrow trail leading into the trees. His boots, the first to disturb the pristine snow. He walked deeper and deeper, the familiar crunch of his steps the only sound in the vast quiet. The moon was bright, casting long, distorted shadows from the skeletal branches of the trees. He felt a strange sense of being watched, a prickling on the back of his neck that he tried to ignore. He was just being paranoid, he thought. It was the cold playing tricks on his mind. After what felt like an hour, maybe more, he realized something was terribly wrong. He could no longer hear his own footsteps. The snow beneath his heavy winter boots made no sound at all. It was as if he was floating, gliding over the surface. He stopped, confused, and listened. Nothing. Just that oppressive silence, and that's when he looked down. His footprints were there, clear as day, pressed deep into the fresh powder. But beside them were others, another set of tracks, running parallel to his own. They were larger, deeper, and they walked in perfect, impossible sync with his. Every step he had taken, this other thing had taken one too. Adam's blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped walking. The second set of footprints stopped too, right beside his. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who could be out here? Why were they walking so close to him, mimicking his every move without making a sound? He slowly, cautiously, took a single step forward. A new footprint appeared beside his. He took a step back. Another footprint appeared in reverse, still perfectly aligned. A wave of pure terror washed over him. He wasn't alone. He whipped his head around, scanning the moonlit trees, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. There was nothing, just the dark, silent woods. He was completely, utterly alone. But the tracks in the snow told a different story. He started walking again, faster this time, his eyes glued to the ground. The second set of footprints kept pace, a silent, menacing shadow at his side. He broke into a run, his lungs screaming for air, his feet slipping in the deep snow. The other footprints ran with him. He didn't know how long he ran, or in what direction. He was lost, disoriented, driven by pure, primal fear. He just needed to get away from his invisible companion. Finally, exhausted and terrified, he stumbled to a halt in a small clearing. He risked a glance behind him. Nothing. He looked down. The two sets of footprints were still there, ending exactly where he stood. He was trapped. The search teams arrived the next morning. The missing person report had come from Adam's worried family when he didn't return home. They found his tracks easily, starting from the edge of the forest. And right away, they noticed the second set. Two sets of footprints, side by side, one belonging to a man in winter boots, the other much larger, almost in. The experienced trackers followed the trail deep into the heart of the forest. They called out Adam's name, their voices swallowed by the dense woods. They followed the prints for miles. They saw where he had stopped, where he had started running. The frantic, desperate pace etched into the snow. The two sets of tracks never wavered, never separated. They continued on, step for step, stride for stride. And then, in the middle of a wide, open clearing, the footprints just ended. There was no sign of a struggle. No scuffed snow, no blood. No sign that Adam had turned back or changed direction. It was as if he, and whatever was walking with him, had simply been lifted straight up into the sky. One moment, there were two sets of prints. The next, there was nothing but smooth, undisturbed snow stretching out ahead. Adam was never seen again. His disappearance became one of the town's darkest legends, a cautionary tale whispered on cold winter nights. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, or what made those second set of footprints in the snow. But some locals say that every winter, when the first heavy snow falls and blankets the forest in silence, two new sets of footprints appear on that old trail. One small, one large, waiting patiently, side by side, for someone else to come and walk with them. Maria had been driving for what felt like an eternity, the endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing under her tires. That's when the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque kind you see in movies, but a sudden, violent blizzard that seemed to erupt from the sky itself. Within minutes, the road was gone, buried beneath a treacherous sheet of white. The dense, dark forest on either side pressed in, swallowing everything beyond the weak beam of her headlights. Then, with a final, sputtering cough, her car stalled. Dead. She tried her phone, her thumb numb with cold as she stabbed at the screen. No signia. Of course, a chilling sense of isolation began to creep in, far colder than the storm raging outside. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to rise in her throat as the temperature inside the car plummeted and the cold started to seep deep into her bones. A faint glimmer of hope appeared through the swirling snow. A light. Squinting, she saw it. Tucked just off the road, nestled among the ancient, snow-laden trees, was a cabin that was made of old, dark wood, the kind that looked like it had stood there for 100 years. A dim, warm light glowed from a window, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a silent promise of warmth. In that moment, she didn't question it. She didn't wonder who it belonged to or why it was there, in the middle of nowhere. All she felt was a primal need for shelter. Shoving her car door open against the wind, she ran. The heavy wooden door creaked open under her touch. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of warmth washed over her, a stark contrast to the biting cold she'd just escaped. A fire was burning quietly in a large stone fireplace, its flames dancing and casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. On a small, rustic table in the center of the room, a single cup of tea sat steaming, as if waiting just for her. It was clear someone had been here only moments before. But the cabin was silent, empty. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion, heavier than the snow outside, suddenly pulled at her. She barely registered sinking into a plush armchair by the fire before the world dissolved into darkness. When Maria woke, it was with a gasp. The first thing she felt was the intense, biting cold. She was lying in a drift of fresh snow, the morning sun glinting off its surface, almost blinding her. She sat up, her body aching. The storm had passed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. She looked around, confused, her heart starting to pound in her chest. The cabin was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No scorched earth from the fireplace. No foundation, not even a single disturbed patch of ground. The only footprints in the vast, unbroken expanse of snow were her own, leading from the dead car on the road to the spot where she now sat. It was impossible. She frantically checked her pockets, her mind reeling, trying to grasp onto something real, something to prove she hadn't lost her mind. And that's when she found it. Tucked deep in her coat pocket, cold and heavy against her fingers, was a rusty iron key. Weeks went by, but the memory of the cabin haunted her every waking moment. The warmth, the tea, the impossible disappearance. She couldn't let it go. Finally, she convinced 2 skeptical police officers to accompany her back to the spot. She needed someone else to see it, to validate her experience. They drove down the same remote forest road, now clear and dry under the late autumn sun. The forest was calm, peaceful. There was nothing there. Maria felt a flush of embarrassment, the officers exchanging knowing glances. She was about to give up, to accept that maybe the cold had made her hallucinate, when one of the officers pointed. "What in the world is that?" he asked, his voice hushed. It was back. It was back. The cabin stood exactly where she remembered it, looking just as old and solid as before. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Maria's spine. This time, they entered together, their boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. The inside was different. It was cold, empty, and covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. There was no fire, no table, no tea. It was just a hollow, forgotten shell. Except for one thing. On the dusty mantelpiece, above the cold fireplace, propped up against the stone, were photographs, old, sepia-toned pictures. Her blood ran cold as she stepped closer. The photographs were of her. One showed her sleeping in the armchair by the fire, her face peaceful. Another showed her standing outside, staring up at the cabin, just as she had done that first night. And the last one made her scream. It was a close-up of her own face, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream of pure terror, looking directly at the camera, as if she knew the photographer was there. The officers didn't need any more convincing. They backed out of the cabin slowly, their hands hovering over their holsters, and Tay left. They left immediately, almost running back to their patrol car. Maria glanced back over her shoulder just as they reached the road. The spot where the cabin had stood just moments before was now an empty clearing. It had vanished again. Maria still has the key. She keeps it locked away in a small box on her dresser. Most of the time, it's just a cold, inert piece of metal. A strange souvenir from a night she can barely believe happened. But sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls outside her window and the world is buried in snow, she feels a strange pull towards the box. And when she takes the key out, it's no longer cold. It's warm in her hand, glowing with a faint, impossible heat, as if the fire from that long-lost cabin is still burning somewhere, waiting for her to come back. Have you ever been deep in the woods, far from anyone, and heard something that just wasn't right? A sound that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Tonight's story is about that feeling. It's about a voice that everyone who walks the forest at night eventually hears. It's soft, familiar, and it knows your name. This story begins with Daniel. He was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who felt more at home under a canopy of leaves than under a roof. He loved the solitude, the crisp air, the raw beauty of nature. One winter, he decided to go on a solo camping trip. It was something he'd done dozens of times before. He chose a remote patch of forest, known for its ancient, towering pines and deep, undisturbed snow. He set up his tent, built a crackling fire, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. The world was silent, muffled by a thick blanket of white. The only sounds were the hiss and pop of the fire and the gentle sigh of the wind through the high branches. As the moon climbed higher, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow, Daniel heard it for the first time, a whisper carried on the wind. He paused, straining his ears. It was so faint, he almost dismissed it as a trick of the air, the way the wind can sometimes sound like a voice. He shrugged it off and went back to watching the flames dance. But then it came again, clearer this time. Daniel, his head snapped up. It wasn't the wind. This was a voice, and it had said his name perfectly. It was a familiar voice, but he couldn't quite place it. It was like a memory, just out of reach. He scanned the dark wall of trees surrounding his small clearing. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone else. He called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" Only the silence answered him. He told himself he was just tired. The isolation was getting to him. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the warmth of his fire, but a cold knot of dread was tightening in his stomach. The voice came a third time, closer now. Daniel, it seemed to emanate from just beyond the firelight, from the deep darkness between the trees. And this time, he recognized it. The shock was like a physical blow. The voice sounded exactly like his own. It was his voice, but not as he spoke it. It was his voice, as he heard it in his own head. The internal monologue that was his constant companion had somehow escaped and was now calling to him from the shadows. Fear turned to a strange, compelling curiosity. Who was calling him? Or what? He knew he shouldn't. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay by the fire, to wait until morning. But the pull was irresistible. It was his own voice. After all, how could he not follow it? He grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness, and took a tentative step into the forest. Daniel. The voice was ahead of him now, leading him deeper among the ancient pines. He followed, his boots crunching in the pristine snow. The air grew colder the farther he walked from his fire. The forest became a maze of black trunks and tangled branches. "Hey," called out. "Where are you?" The only reply was that same soft whisper of his name, always just a little farther away. He walked for what felt like hours. The familiar clearing of his camp was long gone. He was lost, but the voice was his only guide, his only companion in the vast, silent woods. The strange thing was, The closer he thought he was getting to the source, the quieter the voice became. It was as if it was drawing him in, only to fade as he approached. The whisper grew softer and softer, until it was barely audible. Daniel. Then, the sound was no longer in front of him. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. A twig snapped to his left. He swung the flashlight beam, but saw nothing but trees and snow. Then he heard it again, a faint whisper right beside his ear. Daniel Espun aroned, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. He was utterly alone. The air was still. Then, from directly behind him, so close he could almost feel a breath on his neck, the voice whispered his name one last time. Daniel froze. The flashlight slipped from his numb fingers and fell into the snow, its light pointing uselessly at the sky. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. He just stood there, paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole the air from his lungs. The voice was gone. The forest was silent again, but the presence was still there. He could feel it. It wasn't behind him anymore. It was with him, around him, inside him. The search party found him the next morning. They followed his tracks from the abandoned campsite, a single set of footprints leading deep into the woods. They found him standing in a small, snow-covered clearing, a human statue frozen in place. His coat was covered in frost. His face was pale blue, but his eyes were wide open, staring at something none of them could see. His mouth was moving, forming silent words over and over. The doctors at the hospital said it was a miracle he was alive. Severe hypothermia, but his vital signs were stable. Physically, he would recover. But Daniel never spoke again. He never made a sound. He would just sit in his room, staring into space, his eyes holding a look of unspeakable horror. They said his mind was gone, lost to the cold, to the trauma. But sometimes, if you watch him closely, you can see his lips still move. Silently, shaping a word, as if he's trying to call out to someone, trying to lure them into the woods, as if he's whispering someone else's name. So, if you're ever walking in the forest at night, and you hear a soft, familiar voice calling your name, don't answer it. Don't follow it. Turn around, walk back the way you came, and don't stop until you see the light, because it might not be the wind. It might be Daniel, or whatever is left of him. Have you ever felt a chill so deep it seems to freeze time itself? Not just the cold that bites at your skin, but a cold that reaches into the very fabric of reality. Imagine stumbling through a snow-covered forest, the silence broken only by the crunch of your boots. The air is still, heavy with unspoken secrets, and then you see it, a glint of metal, half buried in a drift of pristine white snow. You brush the powder away, and a vintage pocket watch emerges, its silver casing icy to the touch. It's beautiful, ornate, but there's something unsettling about it. You flip it open, the hands are frozen, stopped, pointing to exactly 3:17. It seems like just an old, broken trinket, a relic of a forgotten time. But this is no ordinary watch. Its story is woven into the very woods where it was found. A tale whispered on the winter winds. The first person to find it was a hiker named Leo, a man who prided himself on his knowledge of the local trails. Etuhat Ed found a treasure, something to show off back in town. He pocketed the watch and continued his journey, the weight of it a small, cold presence against his leg. That night, snug in his tent, he was woken by an unnatural stillness. He checked his own digital watch. It was 3:16 a.m. As the numbers flickered to 3:17, the world stopped. The gentle flutter of snow outside his tent froze midair, each flake suspended like a tiny star. The flame of his lantern became a solid, unmoving teardrop of light. He tried to draw a breath, but the air was trapped in his lungs, his chest a frozen cage. A silent scream built in his throat, but no sound could escape. The universe had been put on pause. He was trapped in a single, silent, terrifying moment, for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes. He was a statue in a frozen world. Then, as suddenly as it began, time lurched forward again. The snow resumed its descent. The flame flickered, and the sound of the wind returned. But Leo was gone. Vanished. The only thing left inside the empty tent was the pocket watch, lying on his sleeping bag, its hand still pointing to 3:17. News of his disappearance spread, and search parties combed the forest. They found his campsite, his gear, his footprints leading in, but none leading out. It was a mystery that baffled everyone. A few weeks later, a young woman, a local artist named Clara, was sketching the winter landscape when she found the watch. Unaware of its connection to the missing hiker, she was captivated by its frozen beauty. She took it home, planning to use it as a subject for a new painting. Like Leo, she admired its craftsmanship. The intricate engravings on its case. That night, she placed it on her bedside table. At 3:16 a.m., she woke up, feeling a strange sense of dread. As her clock clicked over to 3:17, her world froze. Her charcoal pencils, scattered on a desk, hung in the air where they'd rolled. A glass of water she'd knocked over in her sudden awakening was a solid, suspended cascade. She was paralyzed, a prisoner in her own room, her mind racing with a terror that had no voice. She could see the moonlight filtering through her window, painting static patterns on the floor. Everything was utterly, completely still. And then, just as before, time resumed its flow. The water crashed to the floor. The pencils clattered onto the wood, but the room was empty. Clara was gone. The only thing left behind was the silver pocket watch, sitting on her nightstand, forever locked at 3:17. Two disappearances, both linked by this one object. The local authorities were stumped. They had the watch in their evidence locker. A cold, silent suspect. A detective, a skeptical man named Miller who had seen it all, decided to investigate it himself. He didn't believe in curses or supernatural phenomena. There had to be a logical explanation. Late one night, alone in his office, he took the watch from its evidence bag. He held it in his palm, feeling its unnatural coldness seep into his skin. He examined it under his desk lamp, looking for any mechanism, any trick. He checked his own watch. It was 3:15 a.m. He waited, a cynical smile on his face, ready to debunk the whole story. 3:16. He felt a strange pressure in the room, the air growing thick and heavy. He told himself it was just his imagination, the late hour playing tricks on him. 3:17. The low hum of his computer ceased. The blinking cursor on his screen stopped. A solid green line, the drip from a leaky faucet in the hallway, hung in space. Miller's smile was frozen on his face. His heart hammered against his ribs, but the sound was trapped inside him. He tried to move, to drop the watch, but his muscles wouldn't obey. He was a statue of disbelief, his eyes wide with a horror that defied all logic. The world had become a photograph, and he was trapped within it. A few minutes later, the office came back to life. The computer hummed, the cursor blinked, the water drop fell. But Detective Miller's chair was empty. The watch lay on his desk, a silent testament to a truth he could no longer deny. After 3 disappearances, the watch became the stuff of local legend. A cursed object, no one dared touch it. The police, unable to explain what happened, and unwilling to risk anyone else, made a decision. They took the watch deep into the forest, back to the same remote area where it was first discovered. They sealed it in a heavy, lead-lined box and buried it deep beneath the frozen ground, marking the spot with a simple, unadorned stone. They hoped that by returning it to its resting place, the curse would be contained. For years, it seemed to work. The disappearances stopped. The story of the frozen watch faded into folklore, a scary story told around campfires. But curses have a way of resurfacing. Time erodes all things, even the resolve to leave the past buried. Decades later, a group of college students, amateur paranormal investigators, heard the legend. They saw it as the ultimate challenge. Armed with ghost hunting gear and a healthy dose of youthful arrogance, they found the old records, pinpointed the location, and set out to find the buried watch. They found the stone marker, and after hours of digging in the cold earth, their shovels hit the lined box. With a sense of triumph, they pried it open. There it was, the silver pocket watch, untarnished by its time in the earth. One of them, the leader of the group, picked it up. He checked his phone. It was just after 3 o'clock a.m. "Let's see what this thing can really do," he said with a laugh. They set up their cameras, their audio recorders, ready to capture proof of the supernatural. At 3:16, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The wind dieth. The nervous laughter of the students caught in their throats. At 3:17, the moment shattered. The digital displays on their cameras froze. The rustling of leaves stopped. The world held its breath. And in that silent, frozen tableau, one by one, they were subjected to the same horrifying paralysis. When time restarted, the forest was empty. The cameras were still running, but the recording showed nothing but a few minutes of static before the scene returned to normal, showing an empty clearing. All that remained was the open box, and beside it, the watch. The watch was never found again after that night. Or perhaps it was. Perhaps it's been found and lost countless times since, each discovery leading to another quiet, inexplicable vanishing. Some say the watch is a gateway, a key to a frozen moment that exists outside of our own timeline, a pocket dimension forever stuck at 3:17 a.m. on a cold winter's night. They say that everyone who has ever held it at that precise moment isn't gone. They're just there, trapped together in that silent, snow-filled forest, unable to move, unable to speak, forever living in the single second between one breath and the next. They are the statues in a frozen garden, waiting for a time that will never come. So if you're ever walking in the woods and you see a glint of silver in the snow, you might want to just keep walking, because some treasures are better left buried, some moments are better left in the past, and some hands of time should never, ever be touched. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine on a quiet winter night? The kind of cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. Tonight's story is about that feeling. A story that will make you think twice before walking alone in the woods after dark. It's called The Child with No Footprints. Our story begins in a small, remote town nestled deep within a sprawling, ancient forest. This town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were hard to keep, but the woods kept secrets of its own. Our protagonist, a woman named Elara, had lived there her whole life. She was a librarian, a woman who found comfort in the quiet rustle of pages and the scent of old books. She loved the forest, or at least she thought she did. She'd spent her childhood playing among its towering trees, building forts from fallen branches, and pretending the whispering leaves were telling her ancient stories. But as she grew older, the forest began to feel different. The familiar paths seemed to twist in new ways, and the shadows seemed to deepen, holding something she couldn't quite name. The locals had their own tales, of course, stories whispered over warm mugs in the town's only tavern. They spoke of strange lights dancing between the trees, of sounds that mimicked human voices, and of people who went into the woods and never came out the same. Elara had always dismissed them as folk tales. Campfire stories meant to scare children. She was a woman of logic, of facts, but some things she was about to learn defy all logic. One particular winter, the snow fell heavier than anyone could remember. It blanketed the town in a pristine, silent layer of white, muffling all sound and making the world feel small and isolated. The forest became a monochrome painting of black trunks and white ground. It was on one such night, with a full moon casting an eerie, blue-white glow over the landscape, that Elara's world began to unravel. She was sitting by her window, a cup of cooling tea in her hands, watching the snow fall gently outside. Her cottage was at the very edge of the town, bordering the forest directly. It was a peaceful scene, almost too peaceful. Then she saw it, a movement at the edge of the woods, just beyond her garden fence. She squinted, her heart giving a little flutter. It was a figure, small, like a child. The child was just standing there, partially obscured by the thick trunks of the pine trees. They weren't wearing a proper winter coat, just a simple, dark-colored tunic that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Elara's first thought was concern. What was a child doing out here, alone, in this cold? It had to be well below freezing. She watched, her brow furrowed, as the child raised a small hand and waved. A slow, deliberate wave. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach, but the instinct to help was stronger. A child was in trouble. She pulled on her heavy boots, grabbed her thickest wool coat, and snatched a flashlight from the hook by the door. "I'm coming," she called out, though her voice was swallowed by the thick, snowy air. As she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The snow crunched loudly under her boots, the only sound in the dead-still night. She made her way to the fence, her flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. The child hadn't moved. They were still standing there, watching her approach. "Hello," Elara called, her voice trembling slightly now. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" She climbed over the low fence and started walking into the forest, towards the child. The snow was deep here, untouched, a perfect, smooth blanket. As she got closer, she could see the child more clearly. It was a boy with dark, messy hair and large, dark eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight. He had a strange, placid expression on his face. Not fear, not cold, just an unnerving calmness. But then, Elara noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. She shone her flashlight down at the snow around the boy. It was perfect, undisturbed. There were no tracks leading to where he stood. No footprints at all. It was as if he had simply materialized out of the cold air. Her breath caught in her throat. The cold she felt now was deep in her bones. This wasn't right. Every logical part of her brain was screaming at her to turn back, to run, to lock her door, and pretend she'd never seen anything. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, held there by the boy's unwavering gaze. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, the words turning to vapor in the frigid air. The boy smiled. It wasn't a warm, childish smile. It was a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his dark, empty eyes. It held a sorrow that seemed ancient, far too old for such a young face. When he spoke, his voice was not the voice of a child. It was a chorus, a whisper of wind through pines, the crackle of ice on a frozen lake, and something else, ... something familiar. "Don't you recognize me, Elara?" the voice echoed, seeming to come from all around her rather than just from the boy. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. How did he know her name? She had never seen this child before in her life. I don't understand," she stammered, taking an involuntary step back. Her boot print was a deep, dark scar in the perfect snow. "I am the part of you that never left," the boy said, his smile widening slightly. "The part that stayed here, in the forest, all those years ago." A memory, long buried, flashed through Elara's mind. A memory from her childhood, one she had suppressed for decades. She was 7 years old, playing hide-and-seek with her friends in this very forest. It was getting dark, and she had hidden herself so well, deep within a hollow log, that her friends eventually gave up and went home without her. She remembered the panic setting in as the woods grew dark and the familiar shapes of trees twisted into monstrous forms. She had been lost, terrified, crying for her parents. She remembered a feeling of absolute despair, a feeling that she would be stuck in the forest forever, that she would become another one of the town's ghost stories. Eventually, her father had found her, but something had changed that day. Her love for the forest had been replaced by a quiet, nagging fear. A fear she never spoke of. "You remember, don't you?" the child whispered, his voice a cold caress. "You ran. You left me behind, but I've been waiting for you to come back." Then, as Elara stared in horror, the boy began to fade. His form flickered like a dying candle flame, his edges blurring into the snowy darkness behind him. The smile was the last thing to go, a disembodied crescent hanging in the air for a moment before winking out of existence. He was gone. Silence descended once more, heavier and more menacing than before. Elara stood frozen, her mind reeling, trying to process what she had just seen, what she had just heard. Was she going mad? Had the isolation of the winter finally gotten to her? She looked down at the snow. Where the boy had stood, it remained a perfect, unbroken sheet of white. But leading away from her, back towards her cottage, was her own set of footprints. And next to them was another set. Small, child-sized, heading in the same direction. Panic, cold, and absolute finally broke through her paralysis. She turned and scrambled back towards the light of her cottage, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She didn't dare look behind her. She threw herself over the fence, stumbled to her door, fumbled with the lock, and slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it as her body shook uncontrollably. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sun rose, casting long, blue shadows across the pristine landscape. A neighbor, concerned after not seeing any smoke from Ilara's chimney, decided to check on her. He called her name, but there was no answer. The front door was unlocked. When he stepped inside, the cottage was empty. A cup of tea sat cold on the windowsill. A heavy coat and a flashlight were missing from the hooks by the door. The neighbor followed a single set of footprints leading from Ilara's front door to the fence at the edge of the woods. Adult-sized footprints belonging to Ilara. They went over the fence and into the forest, and then they stopped. They just... ... ended a few yards in, but from that point on, where Ilara's tracks vanished into thin air, a new set of tracks began. Only one set. Small, child-sized, leading deeper and deeper into the silent, waiting forest. Ilara was never seen again. The town added her name to the long list of people claimed by the woods, and sometimes, on quiet winter nights, locals say that if you look closely at the edge of the forest, you can see two figures standing there, a woman and a small child, holding a hand, waiting. The forest was silent the night Elias brought his camera with him. Not the peaceful kind of silence you find deep in nature, but the kind that feels heavy, suffocating. It was as if sound itself was afraid to exist there. Elias was a professional wildlife photographer, a man who had dedicated his life to capturing the untamed beauty of the world. He had spent years in the most remote corners of the globe, photographing animals that most people would never see outside of a documentary. He trusted his equipment more than he trusted people. After all, cameras didn't lie. They only captured what was truly there. That night, a gentle snow began to fall, its flakes drifting down slowly, blanketing the forest floor in a pristine layer of white. It was beautiful, but also eerie. Elias set up his tripod, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a master craftsman. He carefully adjusted the lens of his high